Привет, ребята, и добро пожаловать на очередной урок русского языка с Language Nerd. In today's lesson, we are going to learn how to finally correctly pronounce these Russian names. Okay, you have probably come across with them, at least with some of them. And the question is now, do you know how to correctly pronounce them? And in today's lesson, I will teach you how to correctly say 5 common Russian male names and 5 common female Russian names. I will explain to you what is the common mispronunciation of these names, especially for the native English speakers, and also I will explain how to correct it so that you can finally say them correctly as they're supposed to be said. Let's start with the male Russian names. You have probably seen these names before, but the question is, do you know how to actually say them the way they are supposed to be said? I often notice with my students that they recognize the names, but they pronounce it very much as the native English speakers would do. So they will apply, of course, their pronunciation of the English letters to the names. Let's start with our first example. Okay, let's get started with our first name. Our first name is, how would you say it? Is it Boris or is it Boris? The correct way to say it is Boris. Boris. This is because the stress goes on the E. So on the second syllable, not the first one. And this is a very common mispronunciation, especially for the native English speakers that I notice, that they would stress the first syllable instead of the second. And because the second syllable is stressed, the O is then pronounced as A, Boris. Our second example is, I've seen this name so many times used in the movies, but they have never pronounced it correctly. They would usually say Ivan, so they stress the first syllable again. And even worse, they can say Ivan. Okay, I know that the letter E is the equivalent for the English I letter, but the thing is that this letter is never pronounced as the I sound. It's always pronounced as E. Okay, so you need to say Ivan, and the stress goes on the second syllable, not the first. Our third example is, how would you say it? Is it Denis or Denise? Now, what I have noticed with the native English speaker is that they would usually say Denis because it is just resembling too much to the English version of the name, Denis, and therefore you automatically say Denis. But in Russian language, the stress goes on the I letter on the second syllable, and therefore the E letter, Y, is unstressed, and therefore it is pronounced as E sound. So it should be Denise. Denise. Our fourth example is it Oleg or Oleg? What I noticed with my students is that they tend to say Oleg. So they read it as O sound and they put the stress on the first syllable. Again, the stress goes on the second syllable, and therefore the letter O is pronounced as A sound. Oleg. Oleg. Also, because the letter G, the consonant G, is written at the end of the word, it becomes H sound. So it is Oleg. Oleg. And our fifth example is, now this name, I'm pretty sure you have seen it too many times, either in the news or in the newspaper. But what I do hear, even in the news centers for the native English speakers, that they say Vladimir. Okay, Vladimir, that's not the way to say it. First of all, the stress is not on the first syllable again. This is the tendency for the native English speakers to put the stress on the first syllable, Vladimir. The stress goes on the second syllable, Vladimir. Vladimir. Also, the last syllable, which is ear, It's not pronounced as sound. Now the sound, Russian language doesn't know this sound, and therefore you need to pronounce it as Vladimir. Ir at the end. Vladimir. I'm sorry to interrupt this video, but I do have a little announcement for you. I have plenty of learning Russian language material available on my Etsy shop, so make sure that you check it out, especially if you're learning it from the start, and I'm sure you will find something that will be of interest for you. Okay, let's move on to the female Russian names and discuss some of the 5 common Russian female names that you most probably mispronounce them. And our first name is actually my name, and many native English speakers tend to pronounce it incorrectly. They tend to do 2 mistakes. The first thing is they stress the first e, and therefore they pronounce it as Elena. Elena. So the first e they pronounce it as a wide e sound. But because the stress does not go on the first syllable, and you can notice the tendency that most of the cases the stress in Russian names will not go on the first syllable. Okay, don't stress the first syllable. The stress goes on the second syllable, and therefore the first e is unstressed. And this is a bit tricky because the first thing is, because the letter e is at the start of the word, it should sound as ye sound. And because it is unstressed, it should sound as e sound. And we then combine these 2 rules, and therefore we get ye sound. And the name should be pronounced as Yelena. Yelena. Now the second mistake that the non-Russian native speakers do is that they pronounce the second e sound, and this is very particular for the native English speakers, as e, and they say Elena. Elena. So they say e sound for the second e, which should be actually the wide e sound, Yelena, because it is a stressed syllable. Okay, our second example is, how will you pronounce this name? I have noticed that because it resembles so much to the English version of the name, Anastasia, that native English speakers tend to mispronounce this name because it resembles too much to the English name. Now the first thing that they do wrong is they put the stress, again, the stress goes on the wrong syllable. So they put the stress on the third a, and they say Anastasia, Anastasia. Instead, the stress goes on the very last syllable, so it should sound as Anastasia, Anastasia. And our third example is it Tanya or is it Tanya? Now, because this name resembles so much to the English version Tanya, the native English speakers tend to say it as Tanya, with a very prominent y sound. But in Russian language, the y sound is not that prominent because the ya letter is just 1 letter and it is just after the soft consonant n. And therefore, it should be pronounced as nya sound, Tanya. So you see, it's not Tanya because the y sound should not be that prominent in the ya letter that is following the soft consonant. So it should be pronounced a bit softer. Tanya. Tanya. Okay, our next example and the fourth name is it Oksana or is it Oksana? The first thing that the non-native Russian speakers get wrong is, of course, to stress the first syllable. And they tend to say Oksana, Oksana, with the O sound. Now, because the stress does not go on the O, and it goes on the A, on the second syllable, it needs to be pronounced as A. So the first O is pronounced as A. Oksana, Oksana. So the stress goes on the second syllable. And our next example is, this is extremely popular Russian name, but it is very commonly mispronounced by non-native speakers. And this is because there are versions of these names in other languages, and then the other that are non-native Russian speakers tend to pronounce it a bit differently, just like in their own language. Now, the first common mistake that I have noticed is that they put the stress again on the first syllable. So they say Sofia, Sofia. When the stress needs to go on the second syllable, so on the E, on the vowel E, Safia, Safia. Okay, and therefore, because the O is in stress, it needs to be pronounced as Safia, Safia. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this lesson. Let me know which name have you been mispronouncing before. And don't forget to press the like button and subscribe to my channel.